right, my name's Joshua Andersen. I'm a permaculture designer and consultant and agroforester, specifically syntropic agroforester. I'm originally from Florida, but I'm managing and developing a farm in Duluth now.
Right around here.
Yeah, I'm a neighbor.
5 minutes away.
Yeah, it's like 6 minutes. And before I start, is everyone here aware of what permaculture is? Do I need to explain it? If you need me to explain it, I can just like drop a really simple. Okay.
Yeah.
Do it anyway.
To quote Bill Mollison, I'm gonna give like the kind of funny one, and then I'm gonna give a legitimate definition. Permaculture is about making a nice place to live. The kind of more like heady answer to that question is permaculture is an ethical design science, specifically ethical design science, aimed at creating self-perpetuating closed-loop living systems. So if you were to break that down, self-perpetuating, it perpetuates itself throughout time. Closed loop, meaning the fertility it creates stays in the location and isn't just like washed away or constantly leaving the site. It's a living system. It's not sterilized. We aren't trying to create situations of sterility or trying to control the processes of nature. We're working within the processes of nature. So it's a closed loop living system. It's taking natural processes and applying them to farm sites or land itself. So the title of the talk, the first part of it, is Understanding Natural Succession. And when I do this talk, normally I have like a whiteboard or a projector, and I can like put a graph up so I can show you guys some things. But
Tell me we've got a whiteboard.
You got a whiteboard?
Yeah, next time tell me.
Shucks. Okay. But so the first part of the title is Understanding Natural Succession, and natural succession, in like the very, very short way of explaining it, is the process from which barren land, denuded land, either through natural disaster or through man-made disaster, we can call it. Yeah. It's the process from which it goes from barren to climax forest. And understanding that process in developing sustainable, long-term, multi-generational food-growing systems is key. It's how we create resilient systems. If I were to have like a graph, and the vertical axis would be like the height of the forest, and the horizontal axis would be time. And right here at the meeting of the horizontal and the horizontal and the vertical axis would be your cataclysmic event, we'll say, or creation, whatever you want to call it. The first things that grow at that point are the things that we as agriculturalists or city dwellers or whatever we might be hate the most. They're the most hated plants, but they serve part of the most important function. They are the plants that pioneer or colonize. I know people don't like the word colonize these days, but they're the plants that move into the space and they create the fertility systems that allow for climax species to later come in. Without the pioneers, without these, I call them spiky, there's kids around, I can't use the actual word, I guess. It's kind of a curse word, but the spiky starts with the B plants that...
Dog just like puppies.
Yeah, okay. Without these plants that are hardy and hard, they're the things that animals and we don't necessarily always want to eat. Without them, there's not the fertility systems in place for the climax species to come in. And I'm going to go off on a little bit of a tangent and then we'll get back to it. One of the big issues that I have with a lot of people who do these big tree plantings, you know, like online, there's all those like YouTube videos with like the slow, like romantic music and like a random person putting a tree in a hole really slowly. One of the issues I have with those is at the end, they're like, we planted like 2 million trees. And they're all like climax rainforest trees. And you know every single one of them is going to die because they're supposed to be raised in like underneath a canopy. So they might plant 2 million trees. 1,000 of them might wind up living, or like 2,000 of them might wind up living. And it's because we're not following these processes. When you plant a climax tree into an early successional system, it doesn't have the things it needs to live. and you can try and put as much water on it. And I know, like, kind of like the agricultural methodology of Southern California is like, just water the shit out of it, and like, it'll live, right?
Sure it doesn't.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing around here. So that's like a big that's another tangent I kind of want to talk about real quick. But from those really hardy, spiky, kind of terrible plants that we all love to hate, there are also plants that produce tons of seed. And in one little handful of soil, those plants will produce hundreds of thousands of seeds. And that's super important. When you try and fight those plants, when you try and control those plants, it's a losing battle, and you're never, ever, ever going to win. Because in that handful of soil, there's 100,000 seeds. So from those plants, you get those small forbs and grasses. You start to get woody shrubs. And those woody shrubs are the next step in succession. They're the things that start to get up above those grasses and forbs, and they create a little bit of shade. They start to reduce that evapotranspiration, which when you're dealing in a low rain situation, reducing evapotranspiration is like the most important thing you could possibly do. Because if you have a monostrata, you could say, you're constantly losing water to evapotranspiration, which means it's essentially raining upwards always. We want to keep rain coming down, not going up into the sky. There's a huge difference between those two things, and they're super important. So you get those woody shrubs starting to form a canopy within itself over the hardy, spiky, early successional species. From there, you start to get into more trees. And the timeline from really hardy, spiky, pioneering or colonizing plants to early successional trees could be 5 years. So these are long processes. The time from cataclysmic event to climax forest could be 200 years. These are the time frames that we're talking about. This is beyond our lifetime. So what I see as an early successional system, and most of what we see around here is quite early successional. It's hard for us as people to understand that is at a very specific place in succession. And we oftentimes try and fight succession because we want it to be a way that we think it should be. And that's really difficult. A great example of a successional tree in Florida is the camphor laurel. It's what people consider to be an invasive species. And it has a 200-year lifespan. And it's hard for us as people who only might live to 90 if we're like really killing it in life. It's hard for us as people to understand that tree is going to outlive us, and there's going to be something after that tree. And what happens after that tree could be a really powerful climax native species. But because it's past our lifespan, it's hard for us to understand that. In Australia, I have a lot of friends in Australia. Camphor laurel, most of the time what they're seeing is that after camphor laurel, which is also an invasive species in Australia, native rainforest trees that are thought to be mostly extinct are what comes after camphor laurel in their succession. So that's a really interesting concept. It's a really, really interesting concept to think that a tree that someone hates because it's not from there can pave the way for a later successional climax species to come through. That was kind of a side note. But in our imaginary graph, that isn't actually there. But after those early successional trees, you get kind of medium successional trees. Sometimes pine. If I'm talking about the southeast, like pine would be considered like an early successional tree. And the oaks are medium to late successional in the southeast. I'm still learning about here. I'm imagining it's kind of similar, that oaks are a little bit later successional. If I'm wrong, someone please correct me.
I think the only thing that I know about it is that when the oak rot was coming in, and like there's this big fear about the oak tree forests in California being destroyed. Basically, what we didn't understand was that the oak trees were not actually the dominant species in California. When we came, the pines were more dominant here, and that once we cut down all the pines, the oaks started coming in, and
Yeah.
it's paving the way for the pines to come back.
Okay, so it's kind of flip-flop from where I'm
But,
from.
I mean, I could be a
Yeah.
little wrong, but that's what I remember.
I love that.
Class.
Thank you very much
Yeah.
for that piece of information. I'm very grateful for that. Not getting super into like specifics with species right now, but I'm just trying to give examples to like explain it. So you have like your medium to your medium successional species paving the way for your later climax species. And these processes, understanding these processes and how they apply to your site or your region is super important. And now we're going to get to the second part of the talk. That was a very brief explanation of natural succession. There's better ones out there. Understanding that and applying it to abundant multi-generational food growing systems. That process that I just explained to you could be 200 to 500 years. I don't have 200 to 500 years to wait for my multi-generational system to come into fruition. So by acting within those parameters and planting within those parameters of natural succession, we can create what I refer to as accelerated succession. Taking a 100-year process and banging it down to 10 years. And that's where it gets a little bit crazy for some people because there's a lot of work associated with it. If we work within our parameters, within the first years of your system, or the first year I should say, you're planting those really hardy pioneering species, those colonizing species. What's really amazing about the day and age we live in, we have what we can call designer weeds. People sell them in big 50-pound sacks. They're called cover crops. So you can actually get your designer weeds, something that you might be a little bit less afraid to grow, and buy a lot of seeds at one time. And you can plant out a lot of seeds at one time. And that's really, 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 really cool when you're talking about developing systems that last a long time. And those cover crops, they're the thing that's a little bit more digestible for some people than the next plants I'm going to talk about. And those are the early successional shrubs and trees. Those early successional shrubs and trees, there are native counterparts to them. But we also live in a time of world biological resources being broadly available to us. And when I'm saying that, I'm saying there are trees that we can plant that aren't from here, that serve a function within our food growing system. And I'm not telling you to go plant exotic trees in the middle of a forest trying to like regenerate itself. What I'm saying is when we are developing food growing systems for ourselves, and we're going to be managing these food growing systems using appropriate world biology, that's a term I coined, by the way, has immense potential to drive the succession of the system forward, because ultimately we want to create super resilient food growing systems, because there's potential for this area, if we're going to bring it home, there's potential for this area over the next 20 years to become very similar to some of the harshest climates in the world. So resiliency is a really, really, really big deal. And if we can use world biological resources, a great example of that is Lucana. If anyone's ever heard of Lucana, it's a nitrogen-fixing legume that is used. I trained in Jordan in the Dead Sea Valley for a little bit, which is like 400 meters below sea level, and it gets 122 degrees in summer. And there's potential. Lucana is one of the main. Prosopis was like the main pioneering tree, but Lucana was another one. Prosopis is mesquite, which is actually a native to here, so we're in the Southwest, so we're like pretty stoked on that. But using world biological resources in those early successional trees has immense potential for our fruiting trees, which I would consider to be our climax species. When we're talking about creating multi-generational food growing systems, instead of the climax species being a pine or an oak, our climax species is going to be macadamia nuts and pecans and citrus or mangoes or coffee or those sorts of things. And these early successional trees, those are what paved the way for those later successional fruiting trees. And what I tell people, Bill Mollison, the co-founder of the permaculture concept, the co-creator of the permaculture concept, for every fruit tree he planted 12 supporting trees, early successional trees. So if he planted one citrus tree, he'd have 12 other kinds of like nitrogen fixing and support trees that are there to literally support that tree until the time that you can cut them down and allow that climax species to come through. I kind of wish I had that whiteboard now, but it's okay. I messed up. That's my fault. I should
erase markers. You could probably.
We can see it. We can see it.
Yeah.
I can
So
imagine it.
there's a bit of when we're talking about I just mentioned cutting down some trees, and a group that I'm really fond of. I totally suggest if any of you are interested, this Agroforestry Academy on YouTube. Felipe and Gennaro, amazing individuals. They're my friends from Brazil. They at the beginning of their like YouTube channel, they say the problem is not cutting down trees. The problem is not planting any. So in this system, in this imaginary system on this flag right here, those early successional trees, for every fruit tree we have a lot more of those early successional trees that are going to pave the way. They're reducing evapotranspiration. They're creating a nice little nursery. When you go to a lot of nurseries nowadays, they have like shade cloth up. These are our shade cloth. This is our biological answer. These trees. I was talking about that earlier, so that's why I pointed. And we're using biology and instead of trying to think of technological answers, because we so quickly fall into like Elon Musk is going to save us with some sort of crazy technology for sequestering carbon and stuff. Trees. Just use your trees. And the thing is we know that those early successional trees, they're going to be worked out of the system. They might live the tree itself might live for 8 years, but we might only want it there for 3. So what we do is we continually cut it down. We cut down to the ground. It's called coppicing. It's been something that's done the Native Americans coppice trees for millennia. So this is a traditional technique. And eventually, after you cut the tree down enough times, it just dies. And that opens up the gap in the system for your fruiting trees or your climax species, whatever it might be, to produce food. It's a pretty sweet concept to me. I love food. I don't know about you guys, but I eat food like every day. So I'm pretty keen on it.
Some people like it.
Yeah. And understanding that each one of these trees that we're planting, these early successional trees, they have different lifespans. So we're not only when we're developing these systems, we're not only stacking in space, we're stacking in time. We're stacking in multiple dimensions, which is the hardest part to wrap your head around. Like, I talk about planting eucalyptus because a lot of my friends plant eucalyptus. But people around here get really, really freaked out about eucalyptus. And understandably, it burns. But,
Falls over too.
yeah. Well,
It spits a lot of leaves out.
I phase eucalyptus out within 3 to 5 years of the system. So I don't want a eucalyptus that's like this big around and like way too high to do anything with. I continuously cut it down. Am I done yet?
No, I got
Okay,
you on here.
okay.
I just wanted to let you go a little bit before that.
We're not gonna chop you down yet.
I have a really big like bad habit of just like talking. So
No, it's not really
yeah.
bad. It's good when you're the speaker.
yeah. So understanding that this tree, I'm gonna just say like this Lucana tree right here that doesn't actually exist, but in my example, this tree might be there for 5 years. A pigeon pea might be there for 2 years. In understanding how that's going to pulse through the system, we're talking about constant growth pulses. And understanding that this tree is going to be gone way before that tree. So you might want to plant that tree a little bit closer to this tree because this pigeon pea, which is a shorter term species, I realize this is a little bit confusing. This pigeon pea that's a little bit shorter term species is going to be gone after 1.5 to 2 years. That one might live for 5 years or 8 years, depending on what we want from it. Because we're actively managing these systems. The amazing thing about being a human is we determine what these systems do.
Sorry,
through our
I guess it
management.
goes anyways.
We're gonna practice next time.
Yeah. I figured
we use
nothing
it on our
out
kids.
before I started.
What was I?
Oh, sorry.
I got lost. No, it's not you guys.
No.
Oh, yeah. So when I talk about the acceleration of the system, before I was talking about this might be a 200 to 500 year system that we're talking about. Our management determines how quickly the acceleration happens. We can have our foot on the gas pedal, banging, going, but we're gonna have to be in there every day. And that's how we begin to feed the world. Yeah. That's kind of how I'm going to end it, because that sounded really sick to me.
Questions?
Yeah, but I'm going to open it up to questions, because I realize I said a lot of words. So if anyone wants to ask me anything, you're more than welcome to.
My first one that came up when you're talking about that is like the whole, because like up in our upper grove, there's a bunch of like taller oak trees and other things on the fence line. And how do you balance out the whole shade, sunlight thing if you're doing that? Because like as far as are you intentionally putting things that don't need as much direct sunlight, or just making sure there's less of a canopy to
So
counteract
that's
that?
where managing through pruning comes in.
Okay.
So in Florida, this situation where it's like basically full shade underneath here, the first thing I would think is if a pruning cycle wasn't wanted, because context is everything with this, you actually determine. If you didn't want to prune this oak tree, first thing I'd say is starfruit. Because starfruit don't need a lot of light. I've seen the best banging, beautiful starfruit I've ever seen in my life were 80 to 90% shade. So but if you wanted to do like a mango right here, you'd have to prune a lot of this stuff out. And what's really important about pruning, I guess I should mention this too. What's amazing about pruning, and the reason why I'm such a pruning fanatic, I love chainsaws, I love machetes, I love all the things. Is something that's really amazing about pruning is when you prune a tree, it releases gibberellic acid, which is a growth hormone, which is actually something that they spray on artichokes. I see some artichokes back there, to try and get them to grow faster. So just imagine in your mind's eye, you have I'm going to go back to Lucana. You have Lucana trees interplanted into your artichokes. And at a certain time, when normally when they grow artichokes on scale, they're spraying gibberellic acid on those artichokes, you pruned your trees. And you're releasing gibberellic acid through the soil, through your mycorrhiza fungal relationships between your plants. Through your messengers, yeah. And you're also releasing nitrogen, because Lucana are nitrogen-fixing legumes, and you're cycling organic matter, and you're getting carbon into the soil. How sick is that? I love that. And all that's just from interplanting trees into a crop.
It's interesting on the pruning, like with cannabis plants, the like topping of them, every time you cut a top off, then two come in place.
Yeah, exactly.
So you could keep actually, like if you know what you're doing and you can like manage it with the plant, you could literally just keep topping and keep bringing in two in every spot until it's time to flower. It just makes the productivity go crazy.
So I was wondering, what does this look like for someone, let's say, horticulture is not their job.
Mm-hmm.
They have another job, they have a life, they
Hire
have
him.
kids, stuff to do.
I hate to say that,
Our
but
president,
so
I said hire him.
you determine the speed at which your system moves forward.
Right.
So if you have a full-time job and you can only work on weekends in your system, then that determines the context from which your system evolves.
Right.
And what I like this is my full-time job. I can be out in the field every single day of the year. I've trained for this for the past decade. So it's a little bit different for me. I put my gas pedal down because I want this to bang.
And when your gas pedal is down like that, is that the 10-year mark?
You can get the system faster than that, yes. I know people, my friends in Brazil, they are fruiting avocado, coffee, mango, and they have their system up and running 4 to 6 years. Yeah. But they're managing. It's like intense. So understanding with farming and with agriculture, even just conventional ag, context determines everything. So you have a full-time job. If you want your gas pedal down, support your local permaculturist and pay them. Pay them something that they're worth. But make sure that they're actually worth what you're paying them also. Because there's a lot of people that talk a lot of stuff, but they've never been out in the field.
There's a lot of good books too, right?
Yeah, there's amazing sources out there too.
Thank you. Also,
Yeah.
So we live in Northern California,
Mhm.
and right now PG&E is taking every single tree 100 feet from the power line, which means that on the iconic 20 going from Lake Tahoe, California, to Nevada City and greater
Mhm.
several cities, all the trees are coming down, and
Thousands.
it's like a graveyard to me, and it's extremely emotional.
Mhm.
So could you just kind of brief me on what that would do for the system?
So she knows how horrible it is.
So I like cry. I take pictures because it's like fucking R.I.P. Like,
So the question I have for you is, what are they doing with the biomass associated with the trees they're cutting down?
like where are they going?
Yeah. Is it just being like put on trucks and like shipped off?
Yeah,
Well, then that's the problem.
yeah. It's really, really bad.
Yeah.
I'm talking like the most beautiful. Like it's so
Mhm.
devastating.
Like thousands of trees.
So
Thousands and big root balls, piles.
They're
taller
trying
trees
to
you could imagine,
expand the highway.
Like, and there's like 4 hairpin turns that
Mhm.
if you went in an ice storm, like you just pray God.
Yeah.
But like, so there'd be these big gaps, and you could never see through it. Just clear cut.
yeah. So what they're doing, one is terrible because they're just doing it for a road, which just cuts off like all ecological function of that site. If they weren't doing it for a road, they're essentially resetting succession, which could be considered a good or a bad thing depending on how you look at the world. It's for power lines and for a highway. They're not doing it holistically. They're not recycling the organic matter. If they were dropping the organic matter around trees that they wanted and recycling, like chipping it, developing fungal networks and those sorts of things, I'd be like, it sucks that they're building a road, sucks that they put a power line right through this amazing situation, but at least they're dropping that carbon down. I can't justify what they're doing. If you were to scale out and look at the macroorganism, the forest as a whole, and they were just cutting those trees down and leaving them there, I'm speaking super contextually, that isn't what's happening. If they're just cutting them down, like doing that, they're resetting succession, which would allow for a whole range of new species to like come about. But they're just building a road.
Yeah.
So
Do you think nature will fight back?
I will fight back. No, I fight back.
No,
That's
it's
my whole
so-
job.
I like can't. I don't know if you guys have been up there, but it is awful. And it's private
I'll send this
road
picture.
pictures also.
Some people would say nature is fighting back, and the grand reset is already coming about.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to say anything on that
Okay.
because it's controversial. If you want to talk about that after the talk,
Okay, fine.
yeah.
Can I join?
Do you
Yeah.
remember your question?
Anyone's welcome to.
Move on.
I did.
Oh,
Save it for the park.
I'm gonna, and then you. Okay,
2-part question.
two part.
Oh,
First part-
yeah, she was first. And we gotta move on.
I've been
Yeah.
raising my hand for a minute.
Oh, okay. You were.
2-part question.
Okay.
So,
Sorry.
first, as far as this environment goes, what are the best, I would say, like best producing fruiting trees for an environment like this? Like, what would you would classify this environment as? Like,
Yeah.
it's a valley, I guess.
Mhm.
The valley on a mountain.
Yeah, and then second part to that question that factors in for the first part, what trees, given the fact that you said that this environment is likely to change in 20 years, what disaster do you see, or what climate change shift
Mhm.
you foresee this?
So the
Taking.
real question I have for you
Uh-huh.
is, what's your context? Are you looking for food production, or are you looking for?
Sustainability as
to
far as
sell?
human species in this space?
Okay, so olive, and there's a bunch of olives planted around here already, but olive is one of the hardiest trees in the world. Hardiest fruit trees, I should say. It produces a high fat oil, which is incredibly important. You can also make like table olives and stuff from it. And yeah, all the delicious things that are amazing. Olive is amazing, and I really think more people should care about olives. You're not going to make any money on olives.
They're good on pizza
No.
too.
No, it's not about
But olive oil,
Um,
you can't make money on olive oil.
The
Like,
thing,
olive oil.
But gigantic.
a crop that I think more people should be attempting out here is cassava. Yucca.
yucca.
Yeah, not yucca.
Yucca.
Yucca. Manihot escalenta is the genus and species.
It's kind
He's
of like.
Mexican too.
Tapioca.
Okay.
Yeah, all those things.
the
That's
sweet
all
potato,
cassava.
right?
Yeah, it's incredibly drought tolerant. It can survive off of the humidity of other plants alone.
Awesome.
And that's the biggest thing here, is California has what I would refer to as unethical water usage.
Stealing from other areas to water
And
this area.
it's it's so sad because the entire avocado industry here, I pointed out before, but the entire avocado industry here is water the shit out of it,
Or it dies.
and then that's like in a place that gets 12 inches of rain a year, that's unethical, and that's the problem. We have to be
capital of the world.
yeah, we have to be looking at the context of the environment that we're in. We get 12 inches of rain a year, and it might go down within 20 years. It could be at 6. We have to be thinking about that when we're planning out our systems here.
And then the second question was why is that? Gonna
Yeah, what climate shift do you foresee?
Chemtrails.
It's
it's gonna
as-
get drier. It's gonna get.
It's gonna
hotter.
get. See, the thing is, and I kind of pointed at this earlier with the conversation I was having with someone. I can't exactly remember who. The thing is the properties around here are designed to drain water. They're not water catchment landscapes.
Not at all.
So when all your water just like goes away,
Right back to the creek.
take some of your
it goes
land
to the creek and it goes to the ocean. It's not soaking into the soil.
You need to slow the water.
And then when you have a monostrata system, you have constant evapotranspiration, which means it's raining upwards. I mentioned that earlier.
It's in the air all the time here. the
So
fall
you're
and
just
everything.
you're constantly losing water. You have no water. Eventually that water gonna be gone.
Just takes one
Maybe.
period of drought to kill a lot of things.
Yeah. It's
Unless the earth makes.
we're living in I hate to say this because I'm like an outsider to California, but the false sense of security that I notice when I'm just like around, I'm like, this place gets 12 fucking inches of water a year. Where I'm from, we get 56. Like if I have a water tank in Florida, it might
That's a bit much.
it might be like a couple months before it gets filled. Here it might be 7 months before it gets filled. If they turn the water off tomorrow, you have 7 months before you get.
We have a false sense of security about everything.
So that's like that freaks me
You know
out.
what? California did used to have a lot more rain, and
It
that's,
did.
like for certain. And we still do have the
Chemtrails.
I mean, probably a lot of factors, you know. But what was I gonna say? Oh, that like we still do have times where it rains a ton. When we first moved here 2 years ago, it was.
It's rainy seasons, rainy years.
Yes, we have rainy seasons, but no, it
ebbs and-
rained for like 2 months.
It ebbs and flows.
Yeah, so.
But the trend is
yeah, no, in California right now it's down, and we've dammed everything. Let her go for her one last question, and then we're gonna.
Land is you need to get started.
you can.
You do this on your like.
One of the guys I learned from had 156 trees on his balcony of an apartment.
On the balcony.
Yeah,
Must have been a big balcony.
it wasn't no bigger than
A lot
this.
of plants inside
No
of it.
way.
Yeah.
He like had to go like this through his
He
trees,
had a
right?
pulley system on the edge of his balcony that was hooked up to his neighbors, like to the people above him, so he can like raise and lower trees. So,
So cool.
it depends on how crazy you are.
Hey.
So it doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't.
Does not matter.
All right.
That was awesome, man.
Thank you.